Since human experience occurs via the brain, it's processes in the brain that produce the difficult, painful experiences of life. The stress, disappointment, dissatisfaction, frustration, worry, sorrow, hurt, shame, anger, unease, the bad news, the ennui, the sense of, is this all that life holds? That we could sum up in a single word, suffering. So how does the brain generate suffering? Let's consider 6 fundamental properties of the brain, each of which is an engine of suffering. These are all hardwired based on billions of years of evolution. They have been essential to promote survival. They have enabled you to be here today, listening to this program. But they are also conditions that lead to suffering. And understanding these can equip you to use and change your brain in ways that lead you to suffer less, feel greater well-being, and function better at home and at work. So it's worth understanding how your brain manufactures suffering. The first of these properties is what you might call the organism-world distinction. From viruses and protozoa, little microscopic creatures, on up to dinosaurs and NFL linebackers, every successful organism needs to maintain a kind of boundary between inside and outside. It needs that boundary to organize internal states and keep control of them so they go well, and it needs that boundary as kind of a platform to direct external behaviors, to protect itself from its environment and get what it needs from it. That boundary establishes a fundamental dualism between self and world. Now, at the conceptual level, being human beings, we apply this dualistic structure to everything. People, objects, thoughts, etc. We make them into discrete things, distinct from other things. This has a survival advantage by saving processing time when we are trying to make split-second decisions about whether to approach or avoid or fight. Yet, while there is a relative truth in the organism-world distinction, the skin is indeed a kind of boundary that establishes inside me versus outside me. In fact, that distinction is really arbitrary. Actually, every organism and the world, including you and me right now, are engaged in an ongoing process of transactions in which they are exchanging matter and energy with each other. For example, every year we rotate roughly about 98% of the atoms in our body. In other words, a year from now today, about 98% of the atoms in your body will be different from the ones that are in your body right now. Ultimately, it is all only one big thing. But this illusion of duality, of separation, leads us to forget, ignore, or be ignorant of the simple truth that our brain created it in the first place to help us survive as a useful fiction. We lose sight of the fact that we are part of the world and that what we do to it will come back to us. It makes us fear the world as other. And that adds to our suffering. Second, there's the identification with the body. The organism, the human being, has to have a way to sense its internal state in order to maintain equilibrium. Then there must be second-order systems that monitor those internal instrument panels, quote unquote, in order to detect changes in them and thus trigger correcting inputs to restore equilibrium. That's some of the recursive or circular processing that Richard talked about earlier. Now, the growing architecture of this internal sensing of the body as you move up the evolutionary ladder, in other words, sensing circuits that are sensed by higher level circuits that are sensed by even higher level circuits that assemble the sensing of lower level circuits in this kind of pyramidal structure, the growing architecture of this internal sensing is nothing but a growing identification with the body. I am my body. And in human beings, the sense of self appears to be neurologically embedded in and intimately intertwined with the deep consciousness of the body's state of being. So that way we have of taking things personally that really aren't that personal, because really we actually are just a bit player in most of the dramas of other people's lives. They're not really targeting us. Anyway, that sense of taking things personally, it's about me, is physically, materially, neurologically embedded in this profound evolutionary process of identification with the body to help it survive. And that takes us to the third engine of suffering that's built into the brain, which is the anxiety of survival. Human beings and our immediate ancestors and their great-grandparents as well have been the prey of other predators at least as much, if not more so, than we've been predators ourselves. Therefore, the brain is hardwired to generate an ongoing small signal of fear to keep us wary and vigilant about the world in order to detect any threats in it. This watchfulness is so deeply ingrained that you naturally wake up around 10 times a night to check your environment for a threat. Then, unless you have insomnia, you go back to sleep with the knowledge of waking erased from your memory. But that anxiety, that kind of apprehensive, low-grade background, scanning of the world, looking for threat, what's going to happen, what could go wrong, what are they thinking, how could it hurt me, etc., is itself unpleasant and a mild form of suffering. Further, that hardwired kind of background refrigerator hum of anxiety makes it harder to bring attention inward, since the brain keeps wanting to look outward, around, to make sure there's no threat. And of course, if you're going to be doing meditations, like later in this program or any time in life, or you're wanting just in general to sort of check in with yourself, it's harder to do that since the natural tendency of the brain is to keep pushing attention outward, to really make sure that it's just a flock of geese instead of an incoming missile. But that makes it a lot harder to go inside. And that anxiety generates negative feelings that get in the way of the positive emotions associated with deeper states of well-being, or, if you're so inclined, deeper states of meditative absorption or concentration. Fourth, seeking stasis in a changing world. It's a fundamental fact that everything is always changing. In other words, it's impermanent. For example, just think about the endless changing of the world itself, the whole planet, from quantum volatility to the Hawaiian Islands sinking beneath the sea in 80 million years or so from now. 4 billion years from now, through natural processes, unavoidable, inescapable processes, the sun will gradually become a red giant, swelling to swallow the inner planets, Mercury, Venus, and then Earth. No Grand Canyon, no Mona Lisa, all gone. Then there is the inherent volatility of the brain. Got synapses firing, neurons dying and needing new pathways for their signals, brain waves rippling through a dozen times a second, an endless incoming fire hose stream of perceptual inputs, a, quote, buzzing, blooming confusion, in the words of William James. But to manage all this, multiple regulatory systems of the brain, from very basic ones to very sophisticated ones, are always trying to impose static order on inherently unstable processes. It's kind of like trying to freeze the river at every moment. And maybe that helps us survive, but there's an inherent strain, an inherent subtle stress we can feel inside ourselves when we get quiet, as the brain tries to kind of freeze life to preserve a platform in which it can function from. Next engine that produces suffering is pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. Now, for every organism, one of the most fundamental survival decisions, carried out biochemically by lower creatures and more consciously by folks like us, is whether to approach or to avoid. In other words, to absorb or to spit out at the microscopic level. This is the basis of the deep machinery of likes and dislikes. Approach or avoid, pleasant or unpleasant. It's all natural, but it leads to the grasping after the pleasant and the resisting of the unpleasant that lead to suffering. So, what's the alternative to these 6 conditions that lead to suffering? Well, as the third patriarch said in Zen, The great way is easy for one with no preferences. Now, that state of mind, the absolute and permanent absence of any grasping or aversion or deluded view of the world, is at least a little ways off for most of us. But meanwhile, let's explore one of the most effective methods found so far by humanity to deal with these evolutionary inclinations toward suffering. And that method is the deliberate use of internally directed practices, such as meditation.